Okay, let's get going. I think everyone knows me. I'm Matt Gutman, and for those who've been asking, Ashu and I got into a fight, and no, just kidding. I'm fine, and Ashu didn't hit me. It is really a pleasure to have Pratap Mehta with us today. He is truly a giant in the field of political theory. He's a public intellectual with few peers, not only in India, but I think globally. He is a voice for Indian democracy, which, as we know, is challenged every day, as democracy is challenged in virtually every corner of the earth. This talk is happening 2 days after horrific events in Florida, in the United States. And I was thinking about that for the last 2 days. And one of the things that strikes me is that when horrific events like this take place here, or they take place in Afghanistan, or they take place in Liberia, or they take place in India, they truly become world events, and it's people in this room who feel them deeply and react to them as best they can. And so we do want to remember 49 people, innocent people who died very recently because of questions of inequality and racism and homophobia and cruelty in the world today. Pratap Mehta is the president of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, India, which is easily the most important think tank in South Asia today, and one of the most important think tanks internationally. What we see in him is the best in civil society, and what we are going to have today is a true leader who will be talking to us about issues of democracy as they relate to particular examples, I'm sure, in India, but with relevance far more broadly. When I asked Pratap what he would like me to say, if there was any book he would like me to push, you can look up on his websites and whatnot, he simply said, tell people I'm a friend of Brown. So I appreciate that very much, but Brown is very proud to have him as a speaker today, a keynote speaker at BRE, to speak to us about global crisis of liberal democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that extraordinarily generous introduction. It's a great privilege to be here and very humbling to be in the presence of this gathering, not just because of several distinguished faculty members and scholars, but what I glimpsed this morning of BRE is a program. It's a truly exceptional program, 100+ countries represented, and really a kind of ideal site to have a global conversation of the kind that is actually becoming increasingly all too rare in an extraordinarily sort of intense global setting. And so when I was asked to speak here, I could have done something more akin to a conventional academic paper, but I had in mind the fact that this is a wonderful opportunity where there are so many people from so many different countries to try and see if there's a couple of questions or anxieties that perhaps crop up in lots of different regional contexts. The name I have given to that anxiety, which is reflected in the title of this talk, is there a crisis of liberal democracy? Question mark. It is something to be debated. In fact, if there is a crisis, what is the nature of this crisis? But the origins of this talk, I guess, came from a sense traveling to different countries, different contexts recently, as I have done, that there was an uncanny similarity to lots of different conversations happening around the world about the future of liberal democracy. In particular, the rise of, again, what is called right-wing authoritarian populism, right-wing nationalism of some variety or the other, and I'll try and get a bit more specific about these terms in a little bit, across the world. You can have that conversation in Philippines, you can have it in Turkey, you can have it in India, you can have it in Hungary, you can have it in Poland, you can have it in the United States, you can have it in France. That there seemed to be something about this moment, right, which is producing an extraordinary anxiety and nervousness about the future of liberal democracy, right? Not that there is any ideological competitor to liberal democracy. People talked about the Chinese consensus, the Beijing consensus replacing the Washington consensus. That's a consensus, if there was ever such a thing, at least as much in crisis as the crisis of liberal democracy is. Not that there is any imminent sense that the constitutional orders that many of these liberal democracies inherited are about to be radically overturned. But there is, a sense of foreboding sometimes that we might be just one or two events away from some fairly significant, disturbing political changes in different parts of the world. So what I'll try and do in the next 30, 35 minutes is try and articulate what this anxiety might be and what are some of the common themes that are, in a sense, emerging in this anxiety. But before I come to articulating what this crisis of liberal democracy might mean, I just want to sort of begin with a couple of sort of caveats. The first caveat, obviously, is that, of course, one needs some historical perspective, as it were, on this crisis. Liberal democracy has been through crises in the past. Obviously, the 1930s comes to mind, and God forbid if we reach those proportions. But you can even think of the 1970s. And as David Runciman has recently reminded us in a sort of interesting rumination on the history of democracy, that kind of democracy seems to sort of oscillate between fatalism and excessive impatience, a condition that Tocqueville had already diagnosed in the 19th century. So there is a possibility that in this moment of stress on liberal democratic values, we might actually come out stronger. I mean, who knows, right? So I don't want to sort of prejudge that issue. It is also the case that anxiety about democracy has always accompanied its sort of existence. The anxiety that formal equality actually disguises substantive disempowerment and can lead to pathologies in the distribution of power. The anxiety that liberty, right, is under threat from two directions. On the one hand, the threat of state power, things like surveillance and so forth. But on the other hand, the fear that liberty gets converted into a form of license and anarchy, which then in turn empowers demagogues of various kinds. That's also an anxiety as old as the experience of liberal democracy itself. The fear that partisanship, one of the key mechanisms of accountability in liberal democracy, easily shades into paralysis, or what Fukuyama now calls vitocracy, right? All of these institutional anxieties have, in a sense, been around, right, for a very long time. And, we can hopefully in discussion argue what's distinctive about this movement. Nevertheless, there seems to be something significant in the air happening at the moment, right? And perhaps I think it's more psychological than can be empirically demonstrated. But even if you look at the academic literature on democracy, I mean, just reading Larry Bartels and Achen's latest book on democracy, it is truly astonishing how low the expectations of democracy are becoming. That we are at that moment where we're simply saying, if these democratic constitutions can survive in a recognizably liberal form, we should be quite grateful. So what is, in a sense, this anxiety? Right? The second preliminary caveat before I come to naming that anxiety that I'd place is, as somebody who's engaged with the practice of Indian democracy, and this may be a point that's perhaps particular to Indian democracy, although I must confess, I see some resonances in the United States in particular, and some other countries. I'm not entirely sure or confident that we have the conceptual tools to actually grasp what is going on. And that itself is actually part of the anxiety that we have, in a sense, about liberal democracy. You could argue that in some senses, right? What we need at this moment, if you want to grasp the structure of politics, right, is not simply technicians and social scientists analyzing social processes, but you almost need a new moral psychology and diagnostics of the human soul. It's almost as if you need literary artists, moral psychologists, to kind of describe to us the kind of condition we are in. Why has aggression become the crucible in which political fantasies are being formed? What is the strange alchemy by which the powerful in society masquerade as its victims? What is this will to simplification embodied in the desire for leadership, right? Why is there in the politics of so many countries across the world such a culture of ressentiment, right? Best characterized by, there's a Hindi writer, Hazari Prasad Dwivedi, who once characterized sort of politics in India in the 1930s as politics where the heart is full but the mind is empty, right? Why is the public-private distinction, right, the bedrock of liberal existence, being erased from so many different directions? What is it doing to our sense of self and identity and presentation? Right? You know, these are the kinds of questions which you sometimes feel, you know, old historians of the Roman Republic, Tacitus, Livy, so forth, had a much firmer grasp on, right, than our kind of technologies of analyzing social processes, institutions, and so forth that we do as professional social scientists. And that is, in a sense, part of what I think this moment that I'm, in a sense, talking about, that we seem to be at the cusp of something which we can't quite fully grasp. Now, what is the anxiety that we are facing? How does one name it? To be provocative and to oversimplify a bit, I'm going to name it the crisis of neoliberal subjectivity, right? I will use this term with a little bit of reluctance. I'm not entirely in favor of using the term neoliberal, partly because it's often used as a term of abuse to give liberalism itself a very bad name, right? I mean, you sort of damn liberalism by prefixing it with something you want to condemn. But I do think there are elements of what we think of as neoliberalism, right, that are actually in severe crisis, and that name and perhaps more adequately capture this moment in our various democracies. Of course, I can stipulate that the exact nature of this crisis of neoliberal subjectivity varies across different countries. It's embedded in very different political and social and cultural contexts. Nevertheless, if you see political discourse from countries as diverse as Philippines to Poland, India to the United States, you will actually recognize some elements of this crisis of neoliberal subjectivity. Right? Now, just one last preliminary kind of remark, and then I will elaborate what this crisis of neoliberal subjectivity is. And this preliminary remark came to me. It was a coincidence that when Matt Gutman and I were kind of discussing a possible topic or exchanging emails for a possible topic for this talk, the book I happened to be reading was Svetlana Alexievich's new book called Secondhand Time, which is a truly astonishing meditation on the post-Soviet experience. And the basic argument she makes after interviewing sort of lots and lots of people in the resonance of the interview, why is there such a nostalgia for the old Russia and contemporary Soviet Union? In fact, even Stalin is beginning to make a comeback by all accounts in terms of, there's a lot of nostalgia for the Cold War, there's a lot of nostalgia for old Russia. And the sense she gives overwhelmingly is that contemporary Russia is facing a crisis of meaning. As she puts it provocatively, Russians wanted a motherland, what they got was a mall instead, right? Seems to be quite a metaphor as it for our times. But more importantly, that it is the yearning for some kind of a redemptive vision, right, that seems to be driving this nostalgia, that as bad as communism was, at least it had some redemptive story to tell. But you can extend that sense of yearning even to liberal democracies. As Michael Ignatieff wrote, I think correctly recently, he says, whatever our politics, we all stand in the need of a historical vision, right? that believes that there is a deep logic to the unfolding of time, right? This is a kind of historical vision that can give the sheer happening of our lives, particularly the political events around us, some meaning or shape, right? Convey to us some idea of collective purpose, right? An intention at least, right? And what Svetlana Alexievich argues in the case of Soviet Union is that in a sense, it's the erasure of that sense of meaning, the sense that there is actually some kind of logic to this unfolding of time, right? That actually characterizes the contemporary Russian experience. Now, I can't speak to how accurate a description is, but I think the central insight, right, that what contemporary societies in general are facing, right, is some kind of distinctive crisis of meaning, is something I do want to borrow from her and deploy for my purposes. So I'll try and act as a kind of cultural critic, although with nowhere with the cultural sophistication of Svetlana Alexievich. Now, what is this crisis of meaning that, in a sense, marks our contemporary moment? As I said, I've chosen to name this crisis of meaning the crisis of neoliberal subjectivity, because for all its worth, a certain kind of neoliberalism is actually what gave this kind of unfolding logic of time a meaning over the last 20 years. I know polemically it's actually very easy to deride neoliberalism, right? This is an ideology of the privileged, it got us off the wrong economic philosophy. But one of the things that made neoliberalism so attractive was that it was a kind of theodicy of our times, right? And it's a theodicy that had 5 or 6 different elements, each of which now is under serious question, right? So the first and the most obvious element, which you might say, as Sherlock Holmes said of Dr. Watson, your grasp of the obvious amazes me, but the obvious is sometimes worth reiterating, is, of course, that the promise that we had been given over the last 20 years, right? What was the meaning of that historical time? The central element of that promise was that growth, productivity, and employment will actually go together, right? That there is some economic design, some set of economic policies, the condition of the world, objective condition of the world is such that, right, economic growth will not only continue, even if it's not spectacular, but the form of that growth, right, would be compatible with not just enhancing productivity, but generating at least sufficient employment across the board, right, to generate jobs. Now, one can render this argument in a sense in economic terms, in crudely economic terms, but this argument also in a sense gave meaning to our sense of endeavors, right? Why are we sacrificing things in the present? Because there is some future story under which this triad can be institutionalized, right? The future of our children will be better than what ours, right? That logic of the unfolding of time. Now, whether we like it or not, right? And there's a technical economics argument which I'm not competent to judge. I mean, Robert Gordon's made a very pessimistic argument. Various other economists are making very pessimistic arguments about this link between growth, productivity, and employment. Whether that economic argument is true or not, and we don't know that, the fact is that this economic pessimism is becoming, in a sense, the default common sense pessimism of a lot of electorates around the world. Even countries that are actually experiencing fairly spectacular growth rates still, right? India's 7.5%. China is slowing down, but not substantially. If you asked people what is the single biggest anxiety they have, the answer that you'll get is jobs. But what's specific about this moment? Jobs are always an anxiety. I mean, that's always been a central concern in every economy, right, at one level. But what's specific about this moment is that there is no coherent articulation of what actually the creation of employment might mean, right? It's not just reflected in the kind of economic dissensus around this, right? it is actually reflected in the sense that we are in uncharted territory, right? Countries seem to want to be doing basic things right? There's a fairly standard set of prescriptions many countries are following. But we still don't have the foggiest idea, right? What the employment elasticity of capital is going to be tomorrow, right? We still don't have the foggiest idea, right? Whether this extraordinary revolution in technology, right, is actually finally going to make Marx's kind of, fantasy or nightmare of capital displacing labor actually coming true, right? So there is, in a sense, this, as I said, the first element of that neoliberal thing was just this promise that there is this logic to this unfolding of time, which will, in a sense, generate prosperity and productivity and jobs. How many people actually believe that with real conviction anymore? In lots of different political environments. Interestingly, even in countries that have done well economically recently, right? So that's the first and most obvious and kind of banal element to start off with, right? The second element of that neoliberal sort of subjectivity, right, this sort of optimism. The second element was the fantasy of a kind of depoliticized economy that could actually deliver precisely the set of policies that conduce to growth, productivity, and so forth. If you think about the rise of populism across globally, what is populism, right? I mean, I'll talk about it in a minute. But at its base, right, populism is the aspiration that wants to restore political control to the economy, right? I mean, that's what gives its kind of animating sense and desire, right? That the economy, the market, these structures, somehow they come back under, in a sense, political control. Now, the tension between, right, the desire for political control, the idea that the economy is something that we have collectively shaped, not something that is passively given to us. This tension is, of course, as old as the birth of capitalism and democracy itself. You might recall Karl Marx's great phrase on sans-jus illusion, right? And sans-jus illusion referred to the idea that sans-jus had, that under modern conditions, right, you could actually create an ideal self-governing republican politics, right? Marx just thought that was just, the silliest illusion you could actually imagine. So at one level, that anxiety has, in a sense, always been part of, again, the discourse of liberal democracy. But that anxiety has, in a sense, come back again with a vengeance, where on the one hand, there is the claim that there is a set of objective economic measures. Austerity is one example, right? Globalization is another. Trade deals, you could argue, another, right? There is one set of objective economic measures that will deliver exactly the outcomes that neoliberal fantasy, in a sense, promised, right? On the other hand, there is the desire, the sense that the democratic control over the economy is profoundly slipping away. And you are seeing a revolt against globalization. There's no question about it, right? Whether it's questioning of trade in the United States, whether it's Brexit, right? Which is fundamentally this kind of fantasy of a self-governing constitutional order now reclaiming, right, its rightful will and agency over anonymous economic sort of processes, right? Okay. So this fantasy of a depoliticized economy, which had shaped our subject, is also coming under question. And in that sense, populism is actually a genuine democratic revolt. I mean, one of the interesting things that makes our time terribly interesting is that you could argue that what you're getting is you're getting a sort of democratic illiberalism setting itself up against a undemocratic liberalism, right? I mean, if you were to kind of put it in a nutshell, right? So that's the second element of this crisis, that this political economy, right? The third element of this crisis, which again, a form of neoliberal subjectivity had sort of shaped us, was broadly, you might call, the crisis of institutions. And the crisis of institutions in most of our democracies have three separate elements to it. This kind of varies depending on the democracy you can talk about. The first element of the crisis of institutions is the crisis of representative institutions, particularly legislatures, right? Most countries in the world that we know of, United States, our prime minister could come and make a joke in Congress about the fact that there's a harmonious relationship between both houses of parliament in India and in the United States. But the idea that the legislative process itself is broken, corrupt, paralyzing, and what you give more weight to depends on different contexts. But that central idea, that the central mechanism by which democracy is mediated, right? Questions of policy, questions of distribution, this process is broken or corrupt, right? Or paralyzing, is become a central motif in politics. I mean, it's not an accident, right? That so many of the leaders that have run in the name of populism have, in a sense, run with this fantasy of overcoming exactly this legislative gridlock. I mean, I don't think it's much of an argument to Donald Trump to say, can he handle or negotiate Congress? The whole point is that he wants to be somebody who's, in a sense, above Congress, right? That crisis of legislatures, right, is, again, fairly endemic. We can debate what the origins of this crisis are. Many political scientists would argue that the crisis is actually a tractable crisis. It's a tractable crisis in the sense that what democracies have not attended to is the plumbing of democracy, even as they have been caught up with the poetics of democracy. And the plumbing of democracy simply means, in a sense, what are the institutional channels, campaign finance, as one example, through which power is aggregated in legislative institutions, right? What are those institutional channels, and how can those institutional channels be reformed? But the crisis of legislators is one element of this institutional crisis. The second element in this crisis, which I do want to draw your attention to, because it goes with the first two elements I talked about, was globally the rise of something that provocatively you might describe as post-democracy, right? The idea that power shifts away from legislative institutions to other kinds of regulatory institutions of the administrative state, right? And courts are one particular example of this. I mean, what Ron Herschel has called the rise of juristocracy globally. And his thesis was essentially that, this rise of the administrative state and the rise of judicial institutions, non-elected institutions, and I'm using the word post-democracy, these are not necessarily anti-democratic, right? Actually spoke to a crisis in representative institutions. But it was also often used as a ruse by elites to keep, in a sense, democratic populism at bay, right? Now, that Faustian bargain with post-democratic institutions worked so long as those institutions delivered that theoretical fantasy of growth, productivity, employment that we were actually talking about, right? But the minute that link is broken, which is you're no longer confident that that architecture of the administrative state, as is currently constituted, independent regulators, so on and so forth, right, which we were prepared to cede political control of them, is actually delivering those results, right? There is going to be a search for, again, a kind of impatience with the sort of dominant institutional architecture. And the third element of this crisis, of this institutional crisis, is probably the most talked about in most democracies, which is the idea that almost all our institutions have become deeply plutocratic in one form or the other. I think William Bryan Jennings, I think once powerfully said that, something to the effect that sort of, plutocracy is in a sense more heartless than a bureaucracy, more insidious than a monarchy, and even more corrupting than an aristocracy, right? But the idea, and again, this is a theme that has resonated in almost every election campaign, right? That the basic institutional structure is not just contingently plutocratic, one corrupt politician here, another corrupt politician there, crooked Hillary there, crooked Congress in India, right? But that there is something inherently plutocratic about the way in which our institutions are designed and function, right? Is is a palpable sense in democracy. Now you put all of these together, and you're cumulatively left with this very large question. Okay? Who does the job of mediating representation in a democracy anymore? Right? Okay? So the institutions that were supposed to give meaning and infuse life into that democratic experience, right? Those institutions are now seen as enemies of exactly that democratic aspiration to self-governance and control, right? And no wonder every single right-wing populist candidate has run against institutions, not for them, right? In fact, saying that they're not institutional actually misses the point of their appeal, because the point is exactly to say, right, that this institutional structure cannot deliver. The fourth element of this liberal subjectivity that I want to talk about, which is again connected to this crisis of representative institutions, is this very strange beast called public opinion, right? And this I do want to dwell on for a couple of minutes. So one of the central mechanisms, right, for not just mediating conflict in democratic societies, right, not just giving clues to policymakers about what they should respond to, but also for generating meaning and solidarity, has been the idea of public opinion, right? I mean, Habermas kind of wrote about the structural transformation of the public sphere in the 18th century, which is the emergence of sites of communicative action, right? Which facilitate collective will formation, which facilitate the sorting out of validity claims, and which facilitate the generation of at least minimum forms of mutual solidarity, right? That, in a sense, was the function of that public sphere, generated certain forms of public opinion. Now, the actual practice of public spheres, of course, has historically always been marked by exclusions and hierarchies, as everybody pointed out in kind of their critiques of Habermas, right? But one of the interesting things about our moment, and this is sometimes hard to convey to American colleagues because you take the concept of public opinion for granted, you know. Of course we know what public opinion is. You just get Gallup and Pew to ask a few questions and we know actually what public opinion is. But try and imagine a democracy in which politicians become less and less sure that they actually know what public opinion is. Okay? Right? In fact, you know that joke about during the French Revolution, this leader who was sort of having a croissant, presumably in a cafe, suddenly sees a crowd running by, and he suddenly gets up and goes after them, and the waiter asks him, "Where are you going?" He says, "I'm the leader, I need to follow them." Right? What are the mechanisms by which politicians actually read signs about what public opinion actually is in a democracy? Right? I can say from the Indian case, one of the most striking things about Indian politicians is not only how risk averse they are. This risk averseness actually comes from a deep sense of a great lack of confidence in actually being able to figure out where public opinion is. I mean, you kind of discover it after the fact, which is often too expensive in politics. What that has meant is, on the one hand, an incredible conservatism in preserving the status quo. Because when you actually don't know what the consequences of a decision are going to be in terms of public opinion, and you don't want to find out after the fact the essence of Deweyan experimental democratic discovery, right? You will, in a sense, kind of preserve the status quo, and the status quo will be broken open largely by people who are actually willing to take reckless risks, right? They are the ones who actually, in a sense, enable democracies to discover something about themselves, often in very ominous ways, as actually we are, in a sense, discovering in this context, right? But more importantly than this question of how do political leaders understand what public opinion is this whole question of what is this beast itself, right? Now, public opinion, notoriously, as Tocqueville had argued, has a reflexive quality to it. I mean, his worry was not majoritarianism. His worry was that if enough people come to believe that something is public opinion, it actually becomes public opinion simply by that act of believing it, right? Now, what are the mechanisms through which we represent to ourselves what public opinion is, right? Representative process is not doing it. The media is certainly not doing it, right? In fact, that's in a sense one of the tragedies of almost all democracies, right? That the structures of information flows in media, right? Almost nobody in India believes that a newspaper is entirely trustworthy. Nobody believes that there is such a thing as a newspaper of record left anymore. Forget television news channels, right? Intellectuals, right? I mean, it's not a coincidence that almost every right-wing populist candidate that has run against precisely this kind of sort of, as much as they've used media in different ways. What they have done is, in a sense, made an appeal to a much more of a Jacobin conception of public opinion, right? The public opinion is basically whoever can stand up and articulate the loudest what they claim public opinion is to be. Right? I mean, it almost kind of reminds you of the last stages of the French Revolution, where you ask the question, who is the people, right? Well, the people have to be present in their unmediated majesty, as it were. But if all the structures of articulating and representing or understanding what that public opinion is are broken, it in a sense creates the space exactly for that demagogue to kind of say, I am the people, right? The third element of this crisis of public opinion, right? So what are the signals of politics? How does public opinion come to be represented? Is a very interesting and tricky one. And here I'll just go out on a limb. So if you look at candidates like Trump, Narendra Modi, even in some ways, although I think he is quite different from Trump in many significant ways for the better, or even Putin. One of the things that's actually very interesting about them is almost all the conventional critiques that we used against politicians don't apply to them, right? How do you satirize people who themselves are capable of being a caricature of themselves, right? Doesn't work. How do you critique people on the charge of lying? In fact, one of the, I think, interesting psychological things that's happening in our politics is, as liberals, we very confidently believe, right, that this vast public sphere, the truth will come out eventually, right? That contestation of ideas will lead to, in a sense, the emergence of truth. But one of the interesting things that's happening is, if you look at a range of political candidates across the world, particularly on the right, our liberal response offered to them is, well, let's just tell the people that they are lying, right? So Trump has uttered X many lies, Mr. Modi has propagandized, right? But there's a kind of curious alchemy at work in this kind of response. And the curious alchemy comes from the fact that this is exactly where the right wing wants to play you, right? Why does it want to play you there? Because their response to saying, when you stake the claim, right, against a right wing candidate, you are lying. Their response is simply to turn around and say, you are lying too, right? Now, if the contest becomes a contest over the fact that somebody is lying, it's actually a much more, it's a very different kind of a contest than a contest that's actually, in a sense, works on the discovery of truth. And one of the interesting, I think, challenges we have in the public sphere right now is, my big worry about sort of the right-wing takeover is not so much censorship or overt censorship, right? In some senses, this generation of right-wing leaders is much smarter than to kind of completely clamp down in different ways. It is that they have recognized that there is a way in which you can use disinformation as a tool, right, of propaganda and an argument much more effectively than the need for censorship. Right? I mean, it's almost as if they've taken kind of Foucault's adage seriously, that knowledge is made for cutting, it's not made for understanding. Right? Okay. So you have, in a sense, this crisis of public opinion, this very sense of how a collective will is formed, collective solidarities are engendered, and how do we come to represent the truth to ourselves seems to be in deep crisis, and the only kind of consequence of it is this Jacobinism. And the last and final element of this neoliberal subjectivity that I want to talk about, which is, again, an interesting one, which is the contrast with the Cold War. So one of the interesting things about democracy, right, is the relationship between democracy and nationalism, which is a very fraught relationship. On the one hand, almost all democracies have had to rely on some form of nationalism to generate a sense of citizenship and social solidarity. I mean, nationalism was that narrative that gave meaning to lives, right? It gives the community an identity in historical time, and therefore marks the subject, which is the subject of the unfolding of historical time. Nationalism has historically, other than religion, the only ideology that can probably consecrate death, right? Nationalism is, in a sense, the one ideology, right, that constructed the idea of the people, right, in its unmediated virtue. I mean, that's the right. But the downside of nationalism is, of course, that the construction of the very narrative of nationalism requires a distinction between us and them, between insiders and outsiders, right? Historically, liberalism's biggest weakness has been that liberalism has no theory of membership, right? Which is exactly the vacuum that nationalism, in a sense, supplied and filled. Now, when that global theodicy, right, this kind of fantasy of this sort of cosmopolitan, even though it was only an elite fantasy, we bought enough of it to give some sense of alternative narrative to our lives and meanings. Perhaps that nationalism, that the need for nationalism had at least blunted and abated somewhat, right? But precisely at that moment of that global, the crisis of globalization, right? Nationalism is coming back with a vengeance, and I don't have time to sort of, in a sense, go through it. But it's a nationalism of a very paradoxical form. Which is to say, one of the differences between the era of the Cold War and now is in the Cold War was, in a sense, a collision between two different totalizing ideologies, right? On the communist side, everything went together, so you don't allow MTV, you don't allow capitalist goods, and you don't allow democracy, right? One of the things globalization has done is that it has actually created such complicated structures of complicity, right, at the elite level, right? So the United States cannot now run an easy argument about the contest between authoritarianism and liberal democracy. It never could, because historically it has also supported authoritarian regimes around the world, but they were always framed under some larger justification of meaning, right? These are our allies in a war against worse forms of totalitarian rule, right? Okay? So there is, in a sense, nothing giving liberal democracy that, in a sense, that distinctive identity and edge that it enjoyed even in the Cold War, for all its kind of other sort of pathologies. The structures of, most authoritarian governments in the world are actually sustained through this process of globalization and being nested into the United States' economy. What that does is it makes it just harder to draw those boundaries between us and them in clearly political terms as it used to be. So we can't say we are the greatest nation in the world because we are a liberal democracy in the fight against authoritarianism, right? Or we are in the fight against totalitarianism or some evil, or in a sense, even more. So what is actually going to be the structure around which this construction of national identity is going to be constructed in a world, right, where all those forces that, at least in theory, right, at least as structures of meaning, were designed to mitigate the edges of nationalism. That's what globalization was in part meant to be, right? That's what the emphasis on growth was in part meant to be, right? All of those forces are weakening or diminishing. So I'll just end with a couple of sort of, in a sense, quick thoughts. So in this kind of crisis, is it a surprise that the only major kind of political ideology to emerge is a form of right-wing populism, right? Which rests on three simplifications. It rests on a procedural simplification, which is that populism is against the messy world of intermediary powers that it thinks is hijacked by plutocracies of various kind, right? Impatience with legislatures, impatience, right, with all those elaborate intermediary institutions, checks and balances that liberal democracies have constructed. It's a populism constructed on a sociological simplification, right? And the sociological simplification is the ability to construct a homogeneous people, uniquely the site of virtue, against some corrupt elite. And this kind of sociological simplification always requires the construction, right, of, in a sense, that corrupt elite. And an identity simplification which basically says that what is required for us to kind of fill this vacuum of meaning, right, is the construction of a form of homogeneous identity in which we can feel at home. Because all those other narratives, whatever else might be their virtues, don't allow us to say, this is a setting in which we feel at home. And I think the deep point that Alexeyevich was making, that when you are confronted with authoritarianisms of this kind, whether it's in the form of Putin or Trump, right? Satan, if you like, where there is a touch of evil to them. Is it going to be enough to combat Satan, right, without invoking some other kind of God in return? Can you, in a sense, counter a vision of hell without painting an alternative vision of heaven in some ways, right? That's that longing for that alternative narrative. Will it be enough to yell darkness when you see these sort of evil forces around you? Or will you need to find an alternative source of light? And the anxiety of liberal democracy is that I think many people very clearly and plainly see the darkness that is enveloping us, but we don't quite see what that light is that will actually make it go away.
Hi. Hello. Yeah. I'm Saransh. I'm from India. And my question was, you briefly mentioned the topic of surveillance.
Yeah.
And you did mention the plutocracy as well. And then how, the tyranny of plutocracy. And that's something that we're kind of seeing in most parts of the world. Inequalities are increasing. And at the same time, the global surveillance, not just through the state, but the state trying to gain access to corporations which are gathering information, be it Facebook, be it Google, and those kind of structures which are kind of, and on the other hand, technology is also erasing a lot of jobs. And that's why, you did mention that whole anxiety regarding jobs. So don't you think the role of information gathering has become so very important? And especially with we saw it in India at least with the Modi campaign, the way they work with social media, they still work with WhatsApp, and so smartly actually, in kind of generating an opinion about themselves and kind of gaining that support. What would you have to say to that?
So this is a very important question, and I'll break it down into two different parts. One is the general point about surveillance, the second about kind of social media and politics. So, I'm actually persuaded by Bernard Harcourt's argument. He makes this, I think, quite persuasive case that one of the reasons, so across the world, right, there's great anxiety about increasing government surveillance, right? And it's being done under a lot of different guises: national security, prevention of terrorism, all those things we can sort of talk about, right? How legitimate those justifications are. But one of the interesting things about almost all liberal democracies is how little political resistance there is left to the kinds of surveillance and intrusion that used to be staple of worries in the liberal side 20, 25 years ago, right? It's not even a political issue. Sort of in some marginal circles, Snowden may be a hero, but, it's like water off a duck's back, right? And I think the point Bernard Harcourt makes in this book, Exposed, is a powerful point, which is one of the interesting things about this moment, and again, it goes back to this kind of crisis of a certain kind of subjectivity, is that historically surveillance sort of works through two mechanisms. If you take two dystopias, right, that in a sense he also talks about, Orwell's 1984 on the one hand, right, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World on the other. So there was one form of surveillance which was really about surveillance as a mechanism for repressing desire and seeking control, right? There is another form of surveillance that actually, in a sense, works through our desires, right? Actually works on fulfilling them in every way that we want, right? And we expose ourselves more and more. So the most important thing about this moment, I mean, when we critique the state comes back and says, guys, I mean, you're sharing so much information with Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, right? I mean, why worry about the state actually not just having more information, right? But in a sense deploying. So if Google can make money off sending your inbox a ad saying, you've just eaten pizza, do you want to consider this other pizza delivery guy? What's wrong with, in a sense, the state using information to sort of fulfill that? I mean, there's a wonderful inversion on this, which actually is, I mean, going back to this issue of the idea of public and private. I don't know how many have read Dave Eggers' novel, The Circle. I'd highly recommend it. Because one of the clever conceits of that novel, there's a central slogan in that novel that privacy is theft. Right? It's a very clever take on Proudhon's idea of property is theft. And the privacy and theft logic goes simply this way. You want a better world, don't you? Yes. Information makes a better world, doesn't it? Right? If you withhold information, you're actually preventing us from making a better world around you, right? We use information to serve you better, right? And in that sense, right, we are in this truly extraordinary moment, actually, where the construction of a liberal idea, which is always premised on this incredible distinction between the public and the private, right? In all kinds of ways. I mean, it was a social distinction about how you actually presented yourself. There was always a distinction between a private conversation between two friends. There were these private spaces where you could articulate your kind of cheapest jokes and whatever fantasies. That entire world has become a public world. I mean, that's what basically social media, in a sense, does. I mean, it's actually kind of created all kinds of problems, or who do you actually claim to know what you don't, right? So that erasure of the public and private, right, in the ways in which we conventionally understood those distinctions, right, is actually a far more kind of ubiquitous feature of it, which is actually making, I think, the problem of articulating political resistance to surveillance relatively hard. I mean, it's just, it's just one of those other things that seems to be happening on the side, right? At the same time as our kind of entire self, as much as it's reasonably possible to imagine these things to be happen, are actually completely exposed, right? So again, it's part of, in a sense, that crisis of, sort of representation. Who do you know and who do you not know? Why do you, right? The specific conception of social media and democracy and Modi's campaign, obviously he was smart enough to realize the power of a medium before almost any other Indian politician did. I mean, you have to give him that. He was way ahead of the curve in that. Nandan Dilekani, who is the founder of India's one of the founders of India's technological revolution, used to say that the contest between the BJP and the Congress in understanding how technology has changed communication was, one was coming in with sort of Kalashnikovs, the other was sort of, still had a little pickaxe. I mean, there was just no contest on this. I think it's still an open question how lasting the political effects of social media are actually going to be. I mean, how do electorates take their formation? We used to worry about television having that influence 10, 15 years ago. And that turned out to be a lot more complicated story. So I don't have any particular views on sort of, in a sense, how it turns out. Except to basically say that I think it is a fact, right, that one of the fantasies that social media had opened with is again this idea of unmediated representation, right, that we can just crowdsource democracy, we can actually crowdsource people's views, right, just say yes or no. I mean, politics is a kind of daily referendum. It turns out that space is also a lot more structured than we realized. That more space is also a lot more manipulable than we actually realized, right? But I honestly don't know how this communication revolution is going to pan out, other than to say that it is going to make the challenge of public opinion articulation a lot more complicated.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Oladipo Isaac from Nigeria. Prof, I want your opinion and how you can resolve the crisis that is developing among the democratic processes that is in the Western world, the development and job creation theory that you discussed, then the emerging social order that is affecting the family system, the faith institutions, and perhaps the society generally, and the threat it seems to be posing to the future of this of the society of today. How do we resolve this? What are the relationships within these emergencies, and how can we resolve the crisis?
Gosh, I wish I had answer to any one of your questions. They're very difficult questions, very important ones. I'll just say a couple of things. I know there'll be nowhere near an answer. I think that in a sense those questions diverse. The first thing is just the most obvious and the most, again, banal thing to say in this context is, one, I think just ways of to begin with having more honest conversations about what these challenges and problems are. I mean, one of the things that I worry about when I look at Indian society, right, and Indian democracy, there are lots of problems: inequality, corruption, institutional decay. We can talk about them. But to my mind, the biggest challenge that Indian democracy is going to face is it's very difficult for any institution, or even any set of private interlocutors these days, actually, even in private spaces, which used to allow that, to do the job of what you might call the mediation of knowledge claims and competing cognitive claims, right? Certainly, I think intellectuals as a class have to reflect on the fact that in our societies, at least, the credibility of the classes that were supposed to do that job of knowledge mediation is probably lower than almost any other class, right? Whether it's journalists, whether it's intellectuals. I mean, it is a profound kind of crisis, right? Which is that the institutions that you thought were empowered to do exactly this kind of mediation, right? Not to prescribe necessarily what should be done, but to at least be the honest brokers in a conversation, right? Be able to say, if you are thinking of X, have you thought of, Y, Z consequence of this, right? All of those institutions, universities in particular, right, are not just in crisis, but it's not an accident that they're actually the target, political target, and politicians can get away with it because there is, in some senses, kind of incredible contempt for the credibility of those mediating institutions, media, intellectuals, and so forth. So the first place to begin with is to say, okay, where is it that conversation is going to happen, which is a honest, reflective, as rigorous as these things can be, mediation of competing knowledge claims, right? Because it is a dangerous thing for a democracy, I think. I think Plato was right about this, that if you actually do think that everything is just opinion and just ideology and just fiction and just fantasy all the way down, right? It could sometimes work out well. You could be enchanted by a good fiction, but it could also sometimes turn out terribly, right? So that capacity of a democracy to, in a sense, mediate truth from falsehood, right? I'm using, where do we, in a sense, kind of, I think, begin to my mind, the political project of democracies has actually been pretty clear for a long time. I mean, I don't think that has fundamentally changed. It's, my favorite articulation of this is actually from a Chinese economic historian, Qin Hui, who has this wonderful line that there's really just one basic task political task in the modern world, which is what you need is a liberal critique of oligarchy at the top and a social democratic critique of populism at the bottom, right? If you could, in a sense, put these two together, right? That is actually the kind of ideological political project. So I'm not sure that you actually, need sort of, in a sense, but what actually it means to have a liberal critique of oligarchy, particularly because, there is one problem in democracy's face, which is democracy is a contest between competing credibilities. It's not always a contest between competing ideologies and ideas, right? It's, do I trust you more or do I trust him? Your preference for ideologies and your ideologies can in part be shaped by the investment you actually have in the credibility of certain people, right? Now, the tragedy, the big reflective question we need to ask is, why are all those people who seem to have many of the right ideas, right, whose moral instincts are on the right side of history, as it were, what is it about their social location, their idioms of articulation, and their embeddedness in certain economic networks that actually people are finding them less and less credible, right? So what you're getting is, in a sense, a contest between, passionate intensity of a very dark kind, right, and the best lack all conviction of the other, other kind. I think that's the question that I think a proper answer would have to be very sensitive to context. So I won't presume to give one. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I have a question. Nowadays, we are believing less and less in politicians. Every time that we are listening to politicians, right now we are realizing that they are not accomplishing what they are doing during the campaigns. And this is not only in the United States. You will have your issues with Donald Trump, but we that are coming with different experience, we know, at least in my case, I am coming from Mexico, that politicians are not accomplish what they said during the campaigns. So how do we face these issues since we really want to make commitments as students, as from different type of disciplines? We would like to change things in this world that is upside down. So we know that they are in the power and they have the chance to do things to change what they are, what we have right now. So when we have this type of politicians that are not accomplishing, and they are lying and saying things that they are not going to accomplish, how do we are going to change this, even if we have these conversations among us in order to change things? Okay. This is my question.
It's a very big question, and I've kind of invited these questions by being sort of recklessly vague and general myself. I think two quick thoughts. So I think one kind of provocative question back is, okay, we don't trust politicians, but who do we trust, right? And again, the answer to this question varies by context, but one of the things that I think worries me about several liberal democracies is that crisis of trust and credibility actually stretches across sections of society. If you take India, for example, right? You can actually run that story about every profession. When Durkheim was writing in the 19th century, one of his great hopes was, right, that what modernity will produce, again as a meaning-inducing sort of idea of subjectivity, right, was the emergence of the middle-class profession as a mediator of morality in society, right? This is a profession that will be based on meritocracy. This is a profession these will be a set of professions would be based on knowledge claims of certain kinds, right? Which would grant them autonomy, right? from kind of all these other, from capital, from state, from various other things, right? And they would, in a sense, fill, right, a kind of both a meaning gap in civil society, but also allow a form of, in a sense, we trust them, right? When we get sick, we go to doctors. When we start, right, we go to lawyers. If you look at India, right, one of the startling things is that the crisis of, let's say, middle-class professions is probably even worse than that of politicians, right? Because these professions are considered to be even more ensnared, right, in precisely these webs of plutocracy, that we talk about, right? This I actually have a paper on. I can sort of share with you. But profession after profession, are lawyers trusted? Are doctors trusted? Not in a kind of dyadic relationship. Obviously, they have sort of knowledge, right? But in the structural relationships that they find themselves, institutional relationships vis-a-vis their patients. Are academics trusted? Are journalists trusted? Right? The one advantage politicians have, I think, over almost everybody, and which is probably the one saving grace of kind of liberal democracy, right, is that, to my mind, the politician's core function is social mediation, right? I mean, everybody else has a kind of profession, a job, knowledge, right? There's a logic internal to that practice. In fact, at one level, it's probably important for politicians not to have too many strong convictions. I think it's important for politicians to actually be open to not fulfilling their promises. To be honest, the thing that scares me more is actually a dogmatic politician. Because I mean, I'm being flippant about it, but more seriously. Because the job of politics is the site of social mediation, right? Where we say, look, there are competing groups, competing interests, there are competing visions of where the society should go, and any large pluralistic society will have those competing visions. There is somebody whose job it is, right, to be able to kind of work all of this out into some kind of workable formula, right? Which is one of the reasons why, intellectuals in politics is a disastrous thing. I mean, I don't think you can go into politics with that sensibility in mind. And the best politicians always have that, right? They give us the assurance, okay, somebody is in charge, somebody is listening, somebody is capable of correcting mistakes, somebody is capable of responding to public opinion, right? So in that sense, one of the curious things about politicians is, as much as we hate them, at least in a democracy like India, they remain the only sort of indispensable profession, if you like, in some ways. And you might say that's actually the bedrock on which we are kind of standing on, right? I think India is a classic example. We individually hate all politicians are corrupt, but we actually love politics, right? We love politics precisely because it performs this one function. The question is, how effectively does it perform that function, right? Right? Are there structures of collective mobilization that prevent politicians from performing that function of social mediation, from actually even beginning to understand what it is that the people sort of want, right? In a sense, in the first place, is the institutional logic of electoral competition aligned in a certain way? This is the plumbing of democracy, as it were, right? That it actually sometimes gives perverse incentives to, ignore the wishes of large numbers of people, quote, small special interests. That's, I think, a much more kind of contingent question, in a sense, varies by context. Social movements, charismatic leaders can break through those moments. But if you want to institutionalize responsive politicians, I mean, that's the plumbing of democracy that we need to attend to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. After that, right?
Hello?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this lecture. I really enjoyed this lecture. My professor in undergraduates used to say that being liberal is little privilege, and particularly being liberal in Indian society, particularly caste-ridden society, is much more privilege. So I have this question because I've been thinking for a while after reaching here, US, coming from India, looking at Modi and looking at Trump. So recently the India witnessed, I'm talking a little more empirical question about India. the India recently witnessed set of crises where you have a nationalism, religion, and caste together collapsed. Anybody who doesn't fit into the particular narrative of nationalism, particular narrative of religion, particular narrative of caste, these three together, in a way say you have to be a Hindi or you have to be a Brahmin to be a authentic Indian, or you have to be its particular setup. So is it so far the liberal elite somehow has covered it up? Or is it covered it up? Certainly because of the emergence of the right wing, it opened up that fault lines. Is it, I'm just still not clear at why if somebody eating meat can be lynched in capital of Delhi, eating simple meat can be lynched in Delhi, and everyday violence about the caste, which comes up openly now. Is it something to do fundamentally sedimented things in the Indian democratic structure? So far, the liberals somehow managed to cover it up. Suddenly, the right wing or the Modi opened it up. Is it? It just can be simply attributed to the emergence of right wing for all this crisis. This I'm not clear at. Is this because of the illiberalism that this identity opened up suddenly? Thank you.
I mean, it's again a very large. We need a whole BRE on these each of these questions. I think I'll give one very quick response. I mean, I think the history of Indian nationalism is quite kind of complicated. I mean, I think one has to kind of bear that in mind. There are different competing versions of what that nationalism consist in, different accounts of membership, and I think it is to the credit of Indian democracy that actually many of the more morally palatable ones have won out often for the most part. So but I think the core point you're making, which if I understand correctly, which I'll surprise, is that one of the reasons liberalism in this broad philosophical sense is in actually crisis is that those who bore that, or who claim to carry the mantle of that ideology, right? Number one. Those groups and those classes, it turned out, were not just complicit in these deep structures of oppression, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why they kind of embrace. They turned it around to their in a sense, their own ends, which created a trust deficit not in liberal ideas. I mean, this is always a very tricky thing in democracy, at least I find. I mean, which is, if you think about how you make judgments about, in a sense, people, right? Which is fundamentally it's a judgment about who do you repose trust in, right? It was the betrayal of that trust, right, that has in a sense created this crisis of legitimacy, right, where you say that the stronger argument is that liberalism is just a ruse for those in privilege to keep out the marginalized and underprivileged. I actually don't buy that. I mean, I don't think that's the philosophical core of liberalism. I don't think that's the ideological implication of liberalism, right? But what is certainly true is that the historical forces and political parties that claimed to be carrying that mantle, right, turned out to betray it, at least in ways that, in a sense, exposed them to this charge of hypocrisy. I mean, one of the interesting things about politics, right, is how central the charge of hypocrisy has become to our political life. And Judith Sklar always used to remind us, I repeat the sentence offer, that, one of the interesting things about hypocrisy is that it's a great tool of psychic warfare, right? It's not a very healthy recipe for public policy. But the fact is, so much of our politics is about hypocrisy. I mean, hypocrisy to the point where some people in the left would rather vote for the extreme right because it's a statement against the hypocrisy of the liberal center, right? I mean, it's a truly astonishing kind of phenomenon, which in part is explained by the phenomenon that you are, in a sense, describing, that the political parties and historical forces that had that opportunity probably betrayed it to the point where it is much more difficult to repose trust in those ideas and institutions.
We have time for one more quick question. There will be a reception afterwards and much more discussion there.
Okay, thank you. I have a quick question. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask, there is sort of growing counter narratives when it comes to our understanding of democracy, especially emanating from authoritarian regimes. So I just wanted your opinion with regards to how probably that may sort of affect, our understanding of conventional type of democracy, especially looking at some of the examples, probably from Africa, like maybe Zimbabwe, where they're coming up with counter, narratives of how they understand, the concept of democracy.
Right. Obviously you know a lot more about these cases, right? But what is the core element that's common to many of these counter narratives, right? The core and what makes one kind of worried about many of these counter narratives, right? So the first core element is, in a sense, obviously this idea that the will of the people can somehow be actually embodied in a leader of some sort, right? That's the unmediated representation of the will of the people through a concept of leadership, and an incredible impatience, right? With all the checks and balances and mediating institutions, separation of powers, all those kinds of things, and this entire liberal panoply that we kind of depend upon, right, to make life more complicated for us, right? An incredible impatience with those, right? The second is, which is a certain kind of technique of political argument, which actually, in a sense, rests a lot on disinformation, probably, right? You could argue, and it's not an accident, right, that the Putins and the Modis of the world and that was actually mastered social media much before anybody else did, right? I mean, it's incredible use. In fact, I think, as I said, my own sense is censorship is actually a less important weapon in their armory, right, than, in a sense, kind of sort of cultures of, in a sense, sort of disinformation. The third element that's common is, in a sense, a turn to nationalism, of ultra-nationalism or radical nationalism of, in a sense, one kind or in a sense, the other. So they have this pattern. I don't want to call them undemocratic. I mean, as I said, to put it provocatively, you could say that this is a kind of democratically illiberal response to an undemocratic liberalism that kind of existed. So there is, that's what makes it hard to deal with, right? In both normative and political, in political terms. So at one level, they represent the gathering of the energy of a certain kind of democracy, right? But their very enactment of that energy will at some point threaten democracy.
Join me in thanking